My daughter-in-law slammed a stack of bills right in front of my face and said like a verdict, "You should leave this house as soon as possible." In that moment, I didn't just hear paper hitting the table. I heard a door in my family slam shut. I froze. The way she looked at me, cold, sharp, stripped of any respect, made me feel like I had just been erased from my own son's life. And the strange thing was, deep in her eyes, I saw something else. Not just annoyance, not just selfishness, but a fear I didn't recognize at the time, but later I realized it was the very reason everything exploded in ways no one could have imagined. I didn't know then that this was only a small spark for a much bigger secret. If that moment sent chills down your spine the way it did to me, leave a comment and tell me which state you're watching from. And if you want to hear the full truth behind this fear, hit subscribe. Don't miss what comes next. I am Evelyn Brooks, a 62-year-old dark-skinned African-American woman. All my life, I believed family was the one place a woman like me could find peace after years of exhausting hospital shifts. I thought I had survived the worst storms life could send me, but I was wrong. The fiercest one came from under the same roof as my son, in a house I once believed would hold me safely through my final years. That afternoon sunlight slipped through the kitchen window, but its warmth never touched the room. Everything felt strangely cold, as if the air itself was holding a secret I wasn't meant to know yet. I walked down the stairs quietly, careful not to disturb Jessica. I had always tried to be gentle, thoughtful, to give my son's family their space. But no matter how softly I moved, my presence irritated Jessica like an unwelcome echo lingering in her home. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, Jessica turned and gave me a look I will never forget. It wasn't tiredness, it wasn't irritation. It was the look of someone who wished she could erase me from this house, as if I were a stain smudging the clean life she wanted. I froze, not out of fear, but out of shock that someone could hold that much coldness in just one glance. I told myself I have never seen a look that wanted to erase me from a home like that. Marcus, who was pouring water, quickly turned and forced a smile, desperate to smooth over the tension stretching the room thin. "Mom, don't mind it. Jess is just stressed," he said quietly, and I could hear the tremble in his voice. He didn't look me in the eyes, and somehow that hurt more than anything Jessica could say. Jessica let out a soft laugh, one with no warmth, only a sharp edge that sliced right through the air. She spoke in a quiet but deadly tone. Stress isn't an excuse for someone to cling to a house that isn't theirs. I didn't fully process her words before a sharp ache shot through my chest. That sentence, even without being loud, hit me straight in the heart. In that moment, I understood Jessica wasn't just annoyed. She wanted me gone, gone from this home, gone from their life. I steadied my breath, but Henry was already behind me. He gently took my hand, his warmth so sudden and tender that tears almost rose in my eyes. "I'm here, don't be afraid," he said softly, just enough to anchor me in that moment. The kitchen, once filled with laughter and the smell of cooking, had turned into a silent battlefield. I felt a line form between Jessica and me, thin, invisible, but dangerous. A line that, if crossed, would shatter everything. I saw Marcus's eyes dart between his mother and his wife. He wanted to speak to defend someone, but in the end, he chose silence. And sometimes silence is more painful than cruelty. I tried to take a deep breath the way I've taught myself to do for decades, but the instinct of a mother whispered that this was only the beginning. It wasn't Jessica's coldness that frightened me. It was the feeling that she was hiding something behind that gaze, something sharper, something meant for me. I didn't know then that this quiet tension was only the warning before the storm. And when that storm finally hit, it wouldn't just tear apart the roof over my head, it would rip my heart clean open. I once thought the cold look Jessica gave me that afternoon was the worst she could do to me, but I was wrong. That coldness was only a thin layer of frost hiding something much larger beneath it. And that something revealed itself the next morning when I stepped into the kitchen and realized the real story was only beginning to unfold. I heard the sharp sound of papers rustling so loud, it felt like someone had torn a book in half. Jessica was standing in the middle of the room, gripping a thick stack of bills, her eyes tightening like she was on the verge of an explosion. The air felt metallic, heavy, the kind of stillness that happens right before lightning strikes. Without a word, she swept the papers across the table, letting them skid until they hit my hand. I flinched slightly, but Jessica didn't care. She spoke with a voice sharp enough to cut through bone. "This is the money you've spent. Pay it." I scanned the numbers rows of expenses I didn't even know I had caused. I looked up and asked, my voice barely steady, "What are you saying?" "Jessica." Jessica straightened her back. No hesitation, no softening, just a frozen stare. "I'm saying this house is not a free shelter." It felt as if someone had reached inside my chest and squeezed my heart, not because of the number on the bill, but because of the way she said it. The cruelty wasn't subtle anymore. It was open, deliberate, meant to wound. Marcus stepped forward, trying to place himself between us, his voice trembling. "Let's calm down." He looked from Jessica to me, but I could see fear in his eyes. He didn't want to choose sides. He didn't want to face either of us. And that hurt even more. Jessica turned to him with fiery eyes, then snapped her gaze back to me. I can't calm down when I'm forced to support someone who doesn't belong here. Her words hit me harder than any shout ever could. Someone who doesn't belong here. Those 4 words cut the last thread I had been clinging to, the one that made me believe I still had a place in this family. My chest tightened. I looked at Marcus, silently begging him to say something, anything, but he lowered his eyes like a child afraid of punishment. Henry stood in the corner, frozen. I knew he wanted to intervene, but he also knew anything he said would prolong my humiliation. Everything happened quickly, but felt painfully slow. I felt every syllable like a needle piercing my chest. The kitchen that once held laughter now felt like a courtroom, and I was the defendant, accused of a crime I didn't understand. I took a deep breath to steady myself, but my body still trembled. The love I had for Marcus couldn't save me in that moment. And whatever bond I'd tried to build with Jessica had never been enough for her to see me as family. In that moment, a brutal truth settled into me. I wasn't being scolded. I was being removed. Jessica didn't want us to live separately. She wanted us gone. I stood there in that kitchen, in the home I once called family, realizing I had just been erased in the most merciless way. I had no idea this was only the first slice of a much deeper wound, one that would push me into the greatest upheaval of my life. That was the moment I understood. I had been cast out of the family, raw and painfully, in a way that took the breath right out of me. I couldn't sleep that night. Jessica's words echoed in my head, cold and sharp like pieces of shattered glass. I lay on the bed with my eyes open in the dark, feeling a pain that wasn't in my body, but somewhere much deeper. It hurt to be insulted by my daughter-in-law, but it hurt even more that my own son stood there watching and said nothing. When the first light of morning seeped into the room, Henry was already awake, sitting straight, his eyes steady, as if he had thought all night and finally reached a decision. He placed his hand on the suitcase and opened it without hesitation. The sound of the zipper was like an explosion inside my chest. Henry spoke in a calm, grounded voice, the kind that told me he had made up his mind. "We're leaving this place with our heads held high." His words tightened something inside me. He wasn't angry, he wasn't blaming anyone, and he wasn't bitter. He was simply protecting my dignity, the only way a man with integrity could, even in a family that had begun to fall apart. I looked around the room at the memories we had built there, the visits to take care of our son, the dinners I cooked, the moments I thought would bring the family closer together. Now, all of it felt hollow. I whispered, my voice trembling. Our son stood there and didn't say a word. Henry paused for a moment, turned to me, and placed his warm hand on mine. "I know, Eve, but we have to protect ourselves. No one's going to do it for us." We walked out into the living room when the suitcase was closed. Jessica stood there, arms crossed, as if waiting for this moment. Her eyes no longer avoided mine. They showed a clear sense of victory fulfilled now that she'd finally forced us out. She said just one short line, each word falling like stone. "The sooner, the better." That single sentence froze the air. I looked at her and no longer saw my daughter-in-law. I saw a woman guarding her territory by erasing someone else's existence. Marcus came down the stairs, face pale from a sleepless night. He looked at me, then at Henry, then at Jessica. His eyes were red, trembling. Then he broke into tears. "Mom, I waited for an apology, for a plea asking us to stay for something, anything, showing he was willing to stand up for me. But Marcus fell silent, trapped between two worlds he wasn't strong enough to choose." I didn't walk away immediately. I looked straight into his eyes, not with anger, but with a pain so deep it didn't need a single raised voice. I said something I never imagined I would have to say to my own child. "If you won't protect me, then I have to protect myself." Marcus lowered his head, tears falling, but his silence was the final nail in the coffin of everything I believed our family was. Henry rolled the suitcase toward the door. No one spoke. No one tried to stop us. Jessica didn't move, didn't soften, didn't show regret. Her silence was louder than any cruel words she had said. I stepped outside, Henry close behind. The front door closed behind us softly, but with enough weight to send a shiver through my spine. No goodbyes, no apologies. No last words. Just the sound of the door closing, like the final thud of earth over a family that once meant something. I stood on the porch, sunlight touching my skin, but unable to warm the coldness spreading in my chest. I breathed in slowly, my lungs tight, but I didn't fall. Henry placed his hand on my back and guided me forward, as if he knew I could collapse at any moment. We left that house carrying the deepest wound a mother can receive. And I didn't know then that I had only taken one step into the abyss. The bottom was far deeper, and life was about to push me down several more layers before I ever saw the light again. Silver Pines appeared before me like a mirage in the middle of a long, exhausting desert. After leaving Marcus's house, after nights of sitting with Henry on park benches, wondering where we should go next, Silver Pines looked like a promise of comfort we hadn't felt in a long time. The entrance was lined with neatly trimmed flowers. The lake reflected the sunlight like a massive mirror, and the buildings gleamed as if someone polished them every hour. But I wasn't a child to be fooled by pretty colors. The moment I stepped into the lobby, I felt something wasn't meant for me. The perfection was too clean, too silent, too expensive for someone like me to ever call home. A receptionist approached with a smile so bright it felt rehearsed. She spoke smoothly, as if reading from a script she'd memorized word for word. "At our facility, you'll be well taken care of as long as payments are made on time." That line was a thin slice of truth wrapped in sugar. Henry nodded politely, still wearing that respectful smile, while I stepped back a little, scanning the space around me. Elderly residents sat on cushioned chairs in the distance, some reading, some sipping tea, some chatting with medical staff. Everything was beautiful, but it was the kind of beauty meant for people who had more money than loneliness. I turned to Henry, my voice low. "Henry, this place isn't for people like us." He placed his warm hand on my back, trying to calm the unease growing in me. "I'm prepared, trust me." I wanted to trust him. I always wanted to trust Henry, the man who had walked beside me through decades of hardship. But in his eyes, I saw something patched together too many times, like the old clothes I used to sew for Marcus, looking fine from afar, but ready to tear with the slightest pull. As we followed the staff member down the hallway, the lavishness became overwhelming. The lights, the carpet, the walls, everything felt like it belonged to another world. When we passed the secondary reception desk, I caught two staff members whispering, "They won't last long here." I froze. My ears caught every syllable. The words stung deeper than I expected. I stood still for a moment, swallowing the sharp ache their whisper left behind. Sometimes the smallest sentence can cut the deepest, even when it isn't said to you directly. Henry turned back, his voice soft. "Eve, are you all right?" I shook my head, though the storm inside me only grew stronger. I felt like an intruder in a world that wasn't mine, a world where people walked freely while I tiptoed in fear of being judged. When the staff member stepped away to fetch documents, I noticed Henry shifting slightly. His hand slipped into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He glanced at it for barely a second before slipping it back in quickly, as if he didn't want anyone, especially me, to see it. I noticed it immediately. Henry had been quieter since we arrived at Silver Pines, and his silence wasn't peaceful. It was a defensive silence, the kind a man carries when he's trying to hide something painful or frightening. We entered our room. It was small but clean, with a window looking out onto the garden and the lake. The beauty of it made me feel sad instead of comforted. It looked too perfect, too much like a mask. I set the suitcase down and watched Henry place our belongings on the shelf, his hands trembling slightly. I didn't say it aloud, but I understood. Henry was prepared, yes, just like he said. But what he'd prepared wasn't a foundation sturdy enough to hold us. It was something far more fragile, an illusion he hoped would carry us forward like a paper boat on water. And we were already drifting into deeper, rougher waves without realizing how close they were. What I didn't know was that those waves were coming faster than I could imagine. The first days at Silver Pines passed slowly, like an old film reel being dragged across the floor. Everything looked beautiful, but the longer I stayed, the more misplaced I felt among all that polished luxury. A place so perfect it no longer felt like real life. And when the first month's bill arrived, the truth cut through whatever fragile peace Henry had tried to create for me. That afternoon, I sat by the window, watching sunlight flicker across the lake. Henry stood by the table, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the banking app on his phone. His shadow stretched long across the floor, thinner and more fragile than I had ever seen it. I heard him swallow hard before turning toward me, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Eve," he paused, his voice sinking into something hollow. "There's only $1,200 left." My heart tightened. 1,200, not even enough to last half a month here. I pulled a chair closer, my hand shaking so badly I had to grip the armrest just to steady myself. "Henry, only $1,200 left," I repeated as if confirming the nightmare for myself. Henry placed his phone on the table, his shoulders collapsing under invisible weight. I gambled and I lost. The room darkened around us. Henry wasn't a reckless man, not even close. If he said gambled, it meant he had tried everything, pulled every string, stretched every dollar until it snapped. And still, we had fallen short. I picked up my phone, praying for something, anything to hold on to. It took me 3 attempts to dial Marcus because my hands wouldn't stop trembling. After many rings, he finally answered. His voice sounded drained, whether from stress or from avoiding me, I couldn't tell. "Mom, we can't help. We're strapped." That one sentence pierced deeper than any blade. I tried again, my voice shaking. "Marcus, what do you mean you can't help, Mom? We're in debt. And the rent and—" His voice faded. The silence that followed was heavier than any refusal. It wasn't that he couldn't help, it was that he wouldn't stand up to Jessica to help me. I knew that even if he never said it. I called Jessica one last time. Not to argue, not to beg, just to hear her say anything that would let me believe she still saw me as human. But her voice came through cold and metallic. "Don't call again." I heard the sharp click of the call ending. That short command, those 3 words, severed the final thread tying me to my family. The phone slipped from my hand, landing on the bed, as if it too had given up. "Why did you push me to this point?" I whispered, not knowing whether I was asking Jessica or asking life itself. My voice cracked, the pain too heavy to contain. Henry came to me, wrapping his arms around me from behind. His embrace was warm, but not even his warmth could thaw the cold sinking into my chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder and murmured, "I'm sorry. I really thought I could protect you." I leaned into him, the room spinning. It wasn't his failure that hurt. It was the truth that both of us were trapped in a storm we never saw coming. I felt small, like a child, lost in a long hospital hallway with no door at the end. As the sun disappeared from the windowsill, the room grew too quiet, quiet enough that I could hear my heartbeat slow and tired. I stood and stepped into the hallway, desperate for a breath of air. That's when everything shifted. The moment I stepped outside the room, a voice behind me broke the silence, a voice I had never heard before, deep and aged, like someone who had walked a very long road. "Are you Evelyn Brooks?" I turned, and there he stood, a stranger, a silhouette shaped by years and secrets, someone who was about to change everything I thought I knew about my life. And that moment marked the beginning of the greatest turning point I would ever face. I turned around and saw a tall, slender man standing in the hallway. His silver hair was slightly tousled, his eyes deep and sharp, carrying an exhaustion that looked older than his body. Under the warm, dim lights of Silver Pines, he didn't resemble anyone who belonged here. He wasn't polished, pampered, or softened by comfort. He looked like someone who had walked through a different kind of battlefield long before he stepped into this one. He walked toward me slowly, but purposefully, stopping a few steps away. His voice was low, raspy, and weighted with something unspoken. "Are you Evelyn Brooks?" I stiffened. The way he said my name sent a cold shiver down my spine. No one at Silver Pines ever paid attention to us, yet this stranger knew exactly who I was. I stared at him for a moment before asking, "Yes, and who are you?" The man placed a hand over his chest, bowed slightly, but his eyes never left mine. "I've come to repay an old debt." That sentence made the hallway shrink around me. A debt between him and me, or him and Henry? I turned toward the door of our room. Henry? Who is he? Henry stepped out, still holding a cup of water. The moment his eyes landed on the stranger, his entire expression changed. It wasn't just shock, it was recognition buried deep, sudden and painful, as if time had snapped back to a moment he'd tried to forget. Langston's eyes softened with a slow, rare smile. "Your husband saved my life." Henry froze. The cup nearly slipped from his hand if I hadn't reached out to steady it. His lips parted, trembling, his eyes widening like he was staring at a ghost. "Langston, is that really you?" And in that instant, I realized this wasn't a casual reunion. Whatever existed between Henry and this man had been forged under circumstances far harsher than anything I'd ever seen at Silver Pines. Something marked by danger, by fate, maybe even by death. Langston stepped closer. "Yes, it's me, and I brought something that has belonged to him for a very long time." I watched Henry's hand move subconsciously to his chest, as if trying to contain the pounding inside. I had never seen him look so unsteady, so vulnerable. The man I had known all my life, steady, quiet, anchored, was suddenly facing a past that was now standing 3 feet away. Langston reached into his coat and pulled out an old envelope, the paper yellowed at the edges, creased with time, as if it had been opened and closed 100 times. He held it gently, almost ceremoniously. I stepped back, feeling my stomach tighten. Ever since we left Marcus's house, I had seen painful things, humiliating things, but the sensation this envelope gave me was different. It was heavy, meaningful, like a door was about to open and reveal something we had never been prepared to see. Langston held the envelope out but didn't release it yet, his voice dropping lower. "Inside this," he said, "is something you should have received 30 years ago." My knees weakened beneath me. 30 years, long enough to raise a son, long enough to lose everything and rebuild, long enough for secrets to rot in the dark until they became poison. Henry reached out slowly, trembling, and took the envelope as if it contained a piece of his own past he thought he'd buried forever. I stood beside him, feeling the whole world fall silent around us, because I knew that whatever was inside this envelope, it wasn't just information, it was a turning point. And I had no idea that inside it was a story the military had buried for over 30 years, the first flicker of light shining into the abyss we thought we had already fallen to the bottom of. Henry held the envelope as if it might fall apart at the slightest touch. We walked back into our room and closed the door, leaving Langston in the hallway with the heavy look of someone who had lived too long with secrets. I looked at Henry and saw his hand trembling, and in that moment I understood that it wasn't just me who feared what was about to be revealed. Henry was facing a past he had either tried to forget or never knew fully existed. He opened the envelope slowly, as if each layer of paper was a year peeling back in time. Inside was a stack of old documents, the edges yellowed, the red stamps faded. Henry flipped to the first page, and I watched his eyes widen as a breath caught in his throat before he turned to look at me. Langston stepped inside after hearing the shuffle of papers, as if he needed to witness what he had brought to us. Standing beside Henry, he said firmly, "They buried these papers. I dug them up." In Langston's eyes was the resolve of a man who had survived battles and the loyalty of someone who had never forgotten the man who saved his life. Henry swallowed hard, then looked at the bold print on the first page, Notice of Compensation Approval for an Injured Service Member. The amount printed at the bottom made Henry whisper, voice faint. I was supposed to receive this? His voice wasn't filled with surprise about the money, but disbelief, like he couldn't fathom being worthy of anything good anymore. For years, Henry had carried guilt for not being able to provide more for us. I knew that. But now the truth said he had been deprived of something that was rightfully his. I pressed a hand to my mouth, tears slipping free before I even realized. Oh my God, Henry. The room tilted for a moment. All those years we struggled, every bill, every sacrifice, every humiliation, and all along this compensation had existed. It had simply been hidden. Langston looked at both of us, his voice low and steady. "You're getting your life back." That sentence felt like a door breaking open inside my chest, not because of the money, but because it meant we were finally being seen, finally being acknowledged. Henry turned to me and pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly, as if trying to shield this fragile moment from all the pain we'd endured. "Eve, we're saved." I buried my face into his chest, letting the tears spill like water after a long drought. "Thank God. Thank you," I whispered, and the last part was for Langston. I held his hand, gratitude swelling so deep inside me I couldn't find the words to contain it. A compensation of $180,000. Enough for us to live the rest of our lives without bowing to anyone, without begging anyone. Enough to leave Silver Pines. Enough to leave the humiliation Jessica had thrown at us. Henry read through every page, his eyes still shaky but glowing with a fragile hope. For the first time in months, I watched him take a deep breath, a real breath, as if a weight had finally slid off his chest. We spent hours going through the documents line by line while Langston patiently explained everything. And slowly, painfully, everything became clear. Henry hadn't just earned this. Someone had deliberately withheld it or buried it over 30 years ago. I looked outside at the evening sky turning orange. It felt beautiful for the first time in a long time. Not because the sky had changed, but because I had. But life never leaves anyone in peace for too long, and the most beautiful moments are often the ones right before the next storm hits. Because while Henry was gathering the papers and I was beginning to breathe again, we didn't know that in the house we had just left, someone was quietly watching, waiting, listening like a predator, sensing movement. And only hours later, in a way we could never have predicted, our good news found its way to Jessica faster than any wind that ever passed through Silver Pines. And the moment she heard $180,000, she began plotting. The next storm was already forming. The news about the $180,000 compensation spread faster than anything I could have imagined. I still don't know how Jessica learned about it, but the next morning, just as Henry and I were sitting by the window in Silver Pines discussing our plan to leave, I heard a familiar sound echoing through the hallway. The sound of heels, sharp, steady, confident, like someone who believed they were walking toward victory. I turned around, and when I saw Jessica standing in the doorway, her makeup flawless, her expression carefully arranged, I knew our peace had lasted only one night. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Her posture was soft, her eyes slightly widened to mimic concern, but underneath it, I saw it, the calculation swirling like a blade behind glass. "Mom, give me a chance to speak," Jessica said, her voice light as air. I rose from my chair, keeping my back straight. Between us now existed a new boundary, one she could no longer break through easily, the truth and the dignity I had regained. I looked directly into her eyes. "Do you want family or do you want money?" Jessica's expression flickered only for a split second, but I caught it. She recovered quickly, tilting her head, forcing her voice to soften. "I just want to make things right." The line sounded rehearsed, polished in front of a mirror, utterly lacking sincerity. If Jessica had truly wanted to apologize, she would have come weeks ago, not the moment she heard we had money. Henry stepped forward, his voice deeper and sharper than I'd heard in a long time. Not after what you've done. His words were like a heavy door slamming shut. Jessica's lips tightened for a heartbeat. She didn't argue, but not because she accepted blame. She was calculating her next move. Marcus appeared in a hallway, breathless, as if he had rushed after her. His eyes were red, filled with regret. Jess' mom has already been through enough. I heard the struggle in his voice. Marcus was never a strong man, but for the first time in months, he tried to stand on my side. Late, fragile, but still a sliver of something I had longed to hear. Jessica didn't let him continue. She turned fully toward me, dropping the gentle mask she had worn since stepping into the room. Her face hardened, eyes cold like stone, pulled from the bottom of a well. "There will come a time when you'll need me." That line wasn't an apology. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't reconciliation. It was a warning, a soft threat, carefully delivered but sharp as a needle. Henry stepped a bit closer to me, protective, as if to shield me from whatever Jessica intended to say next. But she only raised an eyebrow, as if she knew she had planted just enough poison to keep us uneasy. I looked at her with a calmness that surprised even me. No fear, no trembling. Only clarity. For the first time, I wasn't standing before Jessica as someone being pushed out. I stood as someone who had finally been given back what life once took from us. Jessica turned and walked out. The sound of her heels striking the hallway floor was louder than before, like a warning bell echoing down a long tunnel. Marcus lingered a moment, wanting to say something, but in the end only bowed his head and followed his wife. The room fell silent, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the heavy quiet of a sky holding its breath right before a storm. Because Jessica's words still echoed in my mind, every syllable leaving a mark like a scratch on a wall. "There will come a time when you'll need me." And I knew deep in my bones, with the intuition only a mother beaten by storms can possess, that this was no empty threat. It was a real one. A soft threat, yes, but sharp enough to cut. Silver Pines looked the most beautiful in the morning when the early sunlight poured through the glass panes and covered everything with a soft golden glow. But for me, it had never been a beauty meant for someone like us. It was only a temporary shelter during the days Henry and I were forced out of our own son's home, a luxurious box holding the pain I tried so hard to swallow. And that morning, when Henry held my hand and pulled the suitcase toward the door, I understood we had reached the end of our endurance. It was time to step out and breathe for real again. Henry turned to me, his eyes lighter than they had been in months. "Eve, we live for ourselves now." I nodded. That simple sentence carried more strength than any comfort ever could. It felt like the sound of a lock finally clicking open after months trapped in darkness. I tightened my grip on his hand and whispered, more certain than I had ever been, "As long as I have you, I'm not afraid of anything." We walked down the hallway of Silver Pines one last time. The staff greeted us with polite nods, but this time there was a strange mix of caution and respect in their expressions. Maybe they'd heard about the money, or maybe they noticed the change in Henry's eyes. Either way, it no longer mattered. What mattered was that we were leaving, not in shame, but in choice. When we reached the parking area, I saw Marcus waiting, my son with exhaustion carved into his face, but his eyes lit up the moment he saw us. I stopped, not rushing to hug him or speak. I waited for him to say the first word. "Mom," Marcus said, the emotion caught in his throat, "I'll do better." The wound of everything that happened still lay close to my heart, like grit that hadn't washed away. But I saw the sincerity in him, fragile yet real. I breathed out softly and replied, "Let actions speak, not words." Marcus lowered his head, accepting that he would need to rebuild what he had broken. Behind him stood Langston, leaning slightly on his wooden cane, a faint smile on his face. He didn't try to make himself important. He simply stood there like a piece of a story God had sent into our lives at the exact moment we were drowning. "I only wish you both peace," Langston said slowly. I walked toward him and placed my hand on his shoulder, overwhelmed with gratitude. "You're the light at the end of the tunnel." He patted my hand gently. He didn't say more, but I felt the unspoken bond between us. He had once saved Henry's life on the battlefield, and now he had saved both of ours again. When Henry opened the car door, I looked back at Silver Pines for the last time. Not to remember the humiliation, but to remind myself that everything after today would be different. No more being pushed away. No more being seen as a burden. No more living in the shadow of someone else's whims. We drove toward our old house. The scenery slipped past the window, and for the first time in a long while, my chest felt light, as though I had dropped a boulder I'd been forced to carry. At a stoplight, Henry reached over and held my hand, his eyes shining like someone who had just rediscovered the right path after years of being lost. Finally, we pulled up in front of the house we once left in heartbreak. I stood on the familiar front step, my mind swirling. Not from fear, just from the feeling that time had looped back around. Memories flooded in, both good and painful. Henry looked at me and asked softly, "Are you ready?" I nodded. And just as I bent down to pick up our bag, my eyes caught something lying directly on the doorstep. A white envelope, unmarked with no sender's name. Henry saw it too. He bent down and picked it up, frowning. It wasn't an advertisement nor a casual note. It sat there deliberately, as if someone had placed it and watched from afar, waiting for us to return. A shiver ran through me, because even though we had escaped Silver Pines, I felt in my bones that the storm wasn't truly over. And that envelope was the first wind signaling something was coming. I stood at the doorway, staring at the white envelope placed precisely on the threshold, as if someone had calculated the exact spot where I would have to see it. It wasn't crooked, wasn't blown away by the wind, just lay there, silent, waiting. The twilight sky was turning a soft purple, and the last rays of the day caught the envelope, making it stand out even more. My heart pounded as Henry bent down to pick it up. The house behind us was so quiet, I could hear the faint tap of his shoes against the wooden floor. When he handed the envelope to me, my fingers trembled slightly, as though the paper carried the cold breath of someone unseen. I drew a shaky breath. "Henry, it's addressed to me." My voice was low, roughened by an uneasiness spreading through my chest. Henry studied the front of the envelope and frowned. This isn't Langston's handwriting. I had already known that. The handwriting wasn't that of an elderly man. It wasn't shaky or rushed. Every stroke was straight and firm, confident, precise. The kind of handwriting belonging to someone who knew exactly what they were sending and exactly to whom. I stood against the door and opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper neatly folded. No logo, no emblem, just a blank, pristine page. A cleanliness so intentional it felt ominous. I unfolded it, and my eyes landed on one line written in dark ink. "There is something you need to know right now. Nothing else. No explanation, no signature, just that one sentence, sharp, simple, devastating." I felt the paper crumple slightly under my tightening grip. What else is waiting for us? The question escaped me before I realized it. After everything we had been through, being pushed out of Marcus's home, the humiliation at Silver Pines, the unexpected salvation from Langston, I thought maybe life would finally let us breathe again. But this letter, it felt like a knock on a door we didn't want to open. Henry placed his hand on my shoulder, his voice steady, no longer trembling like when he held Langston's envelope. "Eve, we face this together." I looked into his eyes. In them, I saw every storm we had weathered, every scar of hardship, every ounce of strength we'd been forced to find. That strength was what grounded me now. I raised the letter again, its single line burning deeper the more I read it. And something inside me tightened. Whatever message this was, it wasn't small, it wasn't simple, and it wasn't something sent lightly. I leaned back against the door for balance. If this is true, it could change everything. A strong gust swept past us, brushing my clothes as if an invisible hand was urging me inside to whatever awaited. The sun dipped behind the neighboring rooftops, and the world dimmed slowly around us. Henry squeezed my hand and pushed the door open. Warm light spilled out from inside our old home, meeting the cool dusk outside. But I didn't step in immediately. For a moment, I stayed still, feeling the thin boundary between what I knew and what was coming. I looked down at the letter one more time, as if it could answer the very question it raised. "There is something you need to know right now." Jessica's voice, Langston's face, Marcus's pain, the compensation money, the betrayal, the rescue, the loss, the hope. All of it flashed through my mind, pieces of a puzzle I hadn't yet seen the full picture of. One thing was certain, though. This letter opened the door to a new secret, and it was darker than anything we had faced before. And as I stepped inside the house, I knew I was walking straight into the next chapter of a storm that fate had no intention of letting me escape.